Hello, Evangel family. I hope you're doing well. I'm certainly praying for our Evangel families. I certainly miss seeing everyone and look forward to the time that we can be together again. But until then, I wanted to share just a few thoughts that I've had during this coronavirus crisis. I think about the personal characteristics of Jesus when he was on this earth. Perhaps you might think about his love and how Jesus deeply loved those around him. Perhaps Lazarus and how when Lazarus died, we read that Jesus wept. We might think about Jesus and truth and how Jesus stood up to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the religious leaders of the day. We might think about Jesus and his conviction and how Jesus never compromised his life or his message regardless of the circumstances or the situations around him. But we can also think about compassion and how Jesus often showed compassion, particularly in the book of Matthew. So we think tonight or during this moment, what is compassion? To have compassion means to empathize with someone who is suffering and to feel compelled to reduce that suffering. It's more than just a feeling. It's truly to empathize, but also to desire to reduce the suffering of someone else. But journey with me through the book of Matthew for just a few moments. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 35 through 38, we read that Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field." And so Jesus has compassion on the spiritual condition of the crowds around him. But think for a moment as we journey through Matthew, at Matthew chapter 14, verse 13, there's an account of Jesus feeding the 5,000. We read that Jesus was withdrawing to a private place on a boat, but the crowds heard where he was going, and a large crowd began to follow Jesus. And in Matthew 14, verse 14, we read, when Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Let's journey to Matthew chapter 15, beginning in verse 29, and we read about Jesus feeding the 4,000. In this account, Jesus is surrounded by a large crowd, and he's healing. He's healing those who are lame, blind, crippled, mute, and many others. And as this is happening in Matthew chapter 15, in verse 32, we read Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and they have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry or they may collapse on the way." Consider a last passage from the book of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 29. Two blind men receive their sight. Jesus and the disciples are leaving Jericho, a huge crowds around them, and there's two blind men on the roadside that begin to scream out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." But the crowds rebuke the two men, and they tell them to be quiet, and they shout even louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." And Jesus looks and says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they replied, "Lord, give us our sight. We want to see." And in verse 34 of Matthew 20, we read, Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes, and immediately they received their sight and followed him. In our first passage, Jesus shows compassion because in the crowd there were those who were harassed and helpless, those who were spiritually lost and needed a shepherd. In our second passage, Jesus shows compassion for those who were sick, and he began to heal. In our third passage, Jesus shows compassion because people were hungry. They had been with him for 3 days, and he desired them to have food to eat, and he showed compassion. In our fourth account in Matthew, Jesus shows compassion by giving sight to two blind men. But I think of me, I think about the world around us, oftentimes the church. How do we respond to difficult times? How do we respond to those who are hurting? And I think oftentimes we might respond in judgment, and we might think, well, you deserve what's come to you. Or we might respond in frustration, think, what can I really do? And throw up our hands. But Jesus chose compassion. And so I wonder, why did Jesus have such compassion? Well, I believe that Jesus saw the reality of the condition of the people around him. He saw the hurt. He saw the sick. He saw the needs of people. And maybe at times we don't. always have our eyes attuned to the hurting and the needy around us. But Jesus also knew he had hope to offer. He could point people to true relief and to healing. He could help those who were hurting. But ultimately, he pointed people to his Father who could give eternal life. As a church, we have this same responsibility. We can offer people relief. We can help people on this earth. But ultimately, we're to point people to the Father who can give eternal life. And so as we go through this very difficult crisis, I encourage you to think about compassion and how you can truly point people to Jesus. As we experience this crisis, people are in the need greatly of compassion. Friends are hurting, frustrated, feel like families are hurting, some have lost their jobs, people are worried and anxious and fearful, but we know that Jesus is still in control. And so my challenge to you is to find ways that you can show compassion to family and to friends, and find ways that you can point people to Jesus, for he gives more than relief and comfort. He gives true abundant life that's only found in himself. I can't wait to see you again in person. Thank you for watching this video.